the basics of effective communication. The basics of effective communication. Now, we have like a whole module on this in Adwam, but I wanted to highlight, I think, like key components that everyone needs to have when it comes to being, inshallah, a successful and impactful coach in creating change for your clients and obviously for ourselves as well, inshallah. And so I'm going to cover like three main aspects when it comes to effective communication. And those are going to be active listening, creating empathy, and the importance of really, breaking down what effective communication is, right? What does that look like? So those are the three areas, inshallah, I want to cover. And I think the first part, the foundation that I want to, inshallah, lay when it comes to effective communication is being clear, being honest, and inshallah, being positive in our communication. And I want to, emphasize what that means. So when we talk about having clear, honest communication, it's not just obviously what you say, but it's also your tone of voice. Body language is part of that. We convey messages through it. So something that I always emphasize for people, I know some people might be camera shy when they do certain sessions with clients, but obviously even if you're in person, it's so important that alhamdulillah, you're paying attention to the nonverbal cues first and foremost. So your body language says something. So you'll often notice I'll lean in even on a video like that can, and it's not that, I plan it out like it's unintentional, but this does convey, alhamdulillah, warmth. I know it probably, makes you feel like we're having a really personal conversation, and that's really key. So you'll notice sometimes, you might just be aware, first of all, be aware of your body language. What does it usually look like? So sometimes I'll catch people on sessions where they might be just really back or have their arms crossed, and that can, that can really close, like that's the nonverbal communication that's so important before you even start speaking. And I know we hear about this in like public speaking classes and aspects like that, but it's really important, inshallah, that you're clear on that. And then secondly is your tone. So when you're starting off, communicating with your client, starting a session, inshallah, it's really important that we focus on what the tone is that we're coming in with. And again, the goal in today's session is I want you to actually be more introspective. I'm going to ask yourself, what's the tone I give off? And if you're not aware, it's really important to ask people, what is the tone that I give off? And you'll notice my pitch just went up, right? So this tone can emphasize like excitement. I obviously did get excited. That's why, I did that because I'm like, the fact that you could ask someone to get feedback is really powerful. So you need to catch the tone of your voice. Sometimes I'll get people who'll come on and they'll be very monotone and it just stays that same pitch. When a client's coming to you to spark change and transformation, you can have the most impactful tools and you can help guide the conversation with like incredible questions. But if your tone is just very mellow and just staying flat, trust me, it's not going to have the impact you're hoping it will. So I would really encourage you, inshallah, focus and be aware of what kind of tone and do you have pitches, highs and lows, because that will, alhamdulillah, convey a lot in your nonverbal cue and then as you're starting the verbal. So that's really important, inshallah, in conveying the message and creating the energy that you would like. And I talk about energy in some of the other modules in Adwam and in our weekly group coaching session, but energy matters. And your client, like it or not, is coming to you. A big part of it is definitely to change their energy, feel that energy from you. And so, alhamdulillah, these nonverbal cues and our tone can be, inshallah, a really strong starting point of already creating some powerful energy. If that's connecting with you, put that into the chat. And as I'm saying something, if you realize for yourself, like, yeah, I don't think about my tone, or, I do tend to be flat, or my body language. And again, practice this in your day-to-day relationships and conversations right now. That will be, inshallah, really helpful as well. The other part of creating the importance of clear communication, as I said, is honest. And this is a part that, subhanAllah, a lot of coaches will struggle with, I think, especially in the early years, where they feel like they can't be honest with their client. They want to hurt their feelings or they'll hold back on certain parts. And this is where you have to remind yourself, your client is coming to you for honest conversation, support, and growth. And so you want to make sure that doesn't mean you need to be blunt and rude, but it does mean that you need to be honest with your client when they're sharing certain challenges or they're wanting to explore certain areas, that we don't sugarcoat it or we don't hold back from exploring areas that need attention. So for example, if a client is communicating something about a difficult relationship, actually I had this scenario yesterday, so I can share. I had a couple yesterday where the wife was expressing it was a couple. So the wife was on first and she was just expressing like challenges she's having in the marriage. And she was basically, like absolved herself of a lot and was like, my husband is doing this, or, he's not changing that. But it didn't feel like she was having the integrity and honesty of like holding herself to account in certain aspects. And so when her husband came on the session, I opened up the dialogue and I was just like, well, hey, I let him speak and he shared, and I was like, and then I had to call her out. I had to be honest with her and be like, he's sharing some really unhealthy patterns and habits that you are doing to also, contribute to this. Like, I need you to take accountability. Can you share, like, are you aware that you're doing this? And so it was uncomfortable, but if I didn't do that, like, I'm not helping them go to the next level. So being honest in your communication is really important. It's just as important as being an effective communicator, because again, we can be an effective communicator, but if it's void of honesty, there's not going to be a lot of growth happening. And then the other part with being honest is, helping your client to be honest, right? So you being honest with them, but also helping them be honest. And I think one part of this that can be really powerful is encouraging them to use I statements. So exploring, how they feel, what are thoughts that they have, where is, blaming and criticizing happening in their life, but how it's impacting them and the stories they're telling themselves. So again, right? This can be really powerful. I feel, I think, and then this helps them take the focus away from blaming other people and being introspective, looking inward, being honest with themselves. So this is really powerful in just creating effective communication. And then this last part, and this is just for effective communication, and then I'll move on to creating empathy and listening. And that is the importance of being concise and clear in our communication. So especially as a coach, if you can say 2 words instead of 5, do it. And this is something I have to work on. I think sometimes maybe I'm a little unnecessarily wordy, and I'm conscious of, trying to hold back and trying to be concise in my points that I make. So catching yourself, right? Do you tend to ramble? I think the worst thing you can do as a coach is to ramble on a session and the client is just like, oh my God, like, can I speak, or like, can I share? So you want to make sure you don't overpower the session, or again, you might have value to share and you're giving them insights. Keep it concise and powerful. And again, being an effective communicator, inshallah, that's the goal, that you should be able to formulate your thoughts in very concise statements or reflective statements. And I would encourage you, if you struggle with this, practice writing. You should be, inshallah, exposing yourself to reading much more. That will help you expand your thoughts and ideas, and then do some reflective writing. That's going to help, inshallah, build this muscle of being concise, making your point, and then, giving your client, inshallah, space to explore that. And then, that second part of avoiding ambiguity. Sometimes, we might be really general, and again, we're helping our client to not be ambiguous, because that's where growth happens. So you need to make sure you're not being ambiguous as well. So for clear communication, effective communication, help your client always zoom in, be very concise. So when they say, and again, I'm using yesterday's session as a case study, where the one partner shared in the session that, she's always like this. And I said, can you please give me a specific example? Because it's going to help her and it's going to help me understand what exactly you're talking about. So he kept speaking like ambiguous terms and like tiptoeing around things. And I just had to gently ask him to be clear on it, what exactly he's talking about. What's the quality? He kept saying, the underlying issues and and I was like, what is the underlying issue? I need you to be concise. So the more that you are, inshallah, being specific and you're helping your client be specific, watch, alhamdulillah, how growth happens. Watch how, alhamdulillah, you go into deeper conversation. If you keep staying in the ambiguous areas, they're not going to get a lot, and you're not going to be able to help them either, because you're not very clear on what exactly that is. So this is just for clear, effective communication. Now, the other aspect I want to build and some other layers for effective communication, inshallah, is obviously listening, right? And alhamdulillah, we had a whole course on this with Sheikh Mikalan Embraced, but emphasizing the need to listen, to understand, and not respond. And we know this is like the golden rule, right? To listen, to not just respond. And as a coach, You really need to practice this muscle, because if you're always just listening to respond, you might actually jump the gun. You might make assumptions and the client might not feel understood. So I'd really encourage you, inshallah, practice just listening and getting comfortable with the silence. So sometimes, on a session, we're going somewhere deep, I will let my client know, as they're sharing, and I'll just like, I just need a second to like process that. Like I'm really just reflecting on what you said. And so alhamdulillah, it lets them know they're being heard and that I'm not just like getting ready to respond, or I'll ask questions. That really helps me understand too. So I'm very conscious of, on my coaching sessions, not just responding right away, but asking for clarification and letting them know, like, I really want to understand you, understand what you're saying or what your need is or what your challenge is before I even formulate my thought. And so this is really powerful because, again, when someone comes on a session, and our deep need in any relationship is wanting to be heard. Wanting to be heard. And so I would encourage you, inshallah, ask yourself, this is the goal, right? Constantly asking yourself and practicing this in our day-to-day relationships. Am I truly listening? Am I truly listening? And we know how prophetic, alhamdulillah, this practice is. Venting when the person's kind of like going all over the place, or there's not actually any deep reflection happening. And so, when I say help your client be honest and help them use I statements, that's when you can control it from not being venting. Because when they're just like, well, and then, she did this and they went over there and I wasn't included in that, it can become a venting session. So so don't be afraid to interject. Again, that's where the honest communication comes in. So that's when I'll say, but how did that make you feel? Or what was the story that you told yourself when that happened? And this forces them to be reflective. So anytime that someone is not being reflective or introspective, it's not, at that point, it's venting. So anytime someone's not being introspective or reflective, they're just venting, and that's not helpful. And then you want to bring them back, and you can do that with questions, right? How did you respond? What was the story that you told yourself? How has this been impacting you? These are all ways, inshallah, to help them be reflective. Taiba says silence is valuable. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying, like, be comfortable with silence, and also giving your client time sometimes to process. You might just share something that's really valuable and they just need a moment. And sometimes I'll help my client process, right? And I'll say, like, what's that bringing up for you? What are the thoughts? And, they'll just share out loud. And alhamdulillah, that's really powerful. All right. So emphasizing, the need to listen and before we respond, so we can understand better. And this is, inshallah, I think the other, layer of like listening is obviously asking questions, encouraging reflection, showing engagement with yourself by obviously doing that. And also like showing having eye contact, obviously, the sessions are online and Zoom, but also in person, doing this. And like I said, practice this in your day-to-day relationships, right? If being an effective communicator isn't a hat you just want to put on for coaching, inshallah, you want it to be who you are. And alhamdulillah, we know when you do it with the sincerity of gaining the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people feel that, right? People feel that genuine interest from you. So I would say work on that, inshallah. And then now going to number 3 of, building effective communication, and the basics of it is defining empathy and just, and not sympathy, right? So having empathy versus sympathy. And really that comes down to, sympathy is like, oh, wow, like that's really difficult. Whereas empathy is like, trying to not necessarily take on their pain, but understanding that I might not be living this experience, but I can still, feel like how heavy this is for you. Or I can, I don't want to use empathy to define empathy, but basically, I can share, I can acknowledge, I can see how difficult this is for you. And you can do this by validating people, right? And I know a lot of coaches will be like, well, how do you do that without enabling? Validating someone's emotions or situation does not mean that you can't still have honest, truthful conversations, right? But first, in order to create that change, you do have to validate. So creating that space where you're validating and you're recognizing the emotions for your client and helping them through that can create empathy. So that's one way of, inshallah, doing that. Also encouraging the person also to create empathy, right? So a lot of times when people are struggling with certain aspects, and this is where like a lot of trauma-informed coaching comes in when I do it, it's also encouraging people to expand how they're looking at a situation, and can they look at it from the other person's perspective, right? So they can better understand instead of that one story that they're being stuck in. And this is after you've validated, right? After that they feel like they've been heard, that's when I say, well, are you willing to expand yourself and consider what they might have been, looking at this through? And that, alhamdulillah, that is a breakthrough moment. That is a growth moment, inshallah, for your client when they can do that. And building empathy is so important in order for there to be trust in your relationship with your client and to build, inshallah, deeper connection, right? If you really want to connect with your client, the empathy has to happen. And so, like I said, that is through recognizing and validating their emotions and their situation, and then going to the place of, either challenging or helping them expand their thinking and looking at their situation differently, inshallah. And then comes the important part of having, the holding the space for having the different viewpoint or practice that they might have, or cultural differences, not spiritually, right? Like Islamically, we have our framework, but within that, there might be different cultural aspects. And I think it's just, when we're talking about empathy, it's just important to kind of slide that in, that make sure you're conscious that you're not imposing your family culture and not just speaking, like worldly culture, but sometimes it's our family values or culture onto someone else, right? Maybe they have a different way of approaching things or looking at things or what they value more. Again, not talking about out of the bound of Islam within it, being conscious of that on a session, because that can break that empathy and that trust. So making sure that we're not bringing like a bias and judgment into it and keeping that in check, inshallah. And then the final thing of building, I think, effective communication, inshallah, is having people actually practice the skills or roles that you're teaching in the session, or that, alhamdulillah, you're guiding them towards, really slowing down. So sometimes what I'll notice is, certain coaches struggle they'll give like a practical tool, or they'll help their client, have some kind of breakthrough, but then there's no like practical discussion of how they're going to apply that in their life. So this is kind of the action component, right? And this is part of effective communication, inshallah, is pausing and giving them the real life scenario. So saying, let's say you just had a client who has a mindset, and I had this morning with a client where, the all or nothing mindset that they're struggling with. And so practically speaking, okay, well, where are you going to shift this, right? What's the action you're going to take to break this all or nothing? And so we talked about small, consistent habits. And so helping your client make sure that, inshallah, by the end of the session, they have something really tangible, right? They actually know how to apply what they've learned with you. If you had a powerful conversation about, maybe like shifting their mindset or like a behavior in certain aspects that they're struggling on a relationship, asking them, okay, well, how are you going to approach that differently the next time it comes up for you? Or now that you've unlearned this and you realize like how detrimental, whatever skill it is that you were covering with them, how are you going to now approach your role at work differently? Let's say it's something they're struggling with at work. This is going to help them become aware of how it actually shows up in their life and where they get stuck, right? You're literally helping them visualize and go through the motions, right? So next time in the meeting, I had a client, for example, at work, like she was afraid to speak up in meetings. And so we walked through the scenario. I said, okay, next time, imagine you're walking in, you're doing the presentation, and someone and the boss overlooks you. That was like her challenge. Like, she felt constantly overlooked. And so she would not continue contributing. So I said, okay, imagine you're in the meeting, you made your presentation, you make a point, and your manager does not respond and it completely overlooks you. How are you going to respond? And so we, helping her go through the motions and talk it out, and how she would internalize it, how she would, inshallah, action it, was really powerful for her and already helped her get in the scenario of being, inshallah, the person that she wants to be in that specific situation and context. And so then I was able to give her feedback and some guidance on, what she did really well, where, inshallah, she, I can see her still getting stuck and she needs to work on. And so this really is empowering for your client. And alhamdulillah, that's like the training wheels that we all need in certain moments. So those are the layers, I think, of effective communication as a coach. If you can, inshallah, implement them for yourself, for your clients, these are like really foundational, again, powerful in ways to, alhamdulillah, create change. It doesn't matter what niche you're in. I think this is like across the board important for everyone when it comes to having effective communication as a coach. And if you don't get this part down, it's really hard to have effective sessions, right? If you can't have these principles of effective communication, it's going to be really hard to communicate your value to your client, and most importantly, create, inshallah, change for your client.